one of the main things is that we've seen quite big leaps in technology over the last few years, especially with concepts such as AI and semantic understanding. So that's meant that the technology can now foster much more interesting and nuanced conversations around brand safety. So if you think about a keyword block list, it's very much expressing things in the negative. You're saying, I don't want to be on terrorist content, or I don't want to be on content about disease or plane crashes or something like that. So it's very much the negative, what you want to avoid. Whereas the technology now has moved on to the point where we can now start to think about suitability. So brands spend a lot of money and time and effort into thinking about how do they define themselves? What is their brand personality? So if you take something like Apple, for example, they're quite hipster, they're quite modern, very current. So the idea is that brands can start to think about brand safety and brand suitability in almost the same way. So Apple, for example, instead of saying, I don't want to target negative content, could start to say, well, actually, I want to target hipster content. So framing their suitability and their safety in what it is that they want to target rather than what they want to avoid. And in this way, they can start to not just think about what do I want to not be next to and what kind of content is not sitting well with my brand, but they can start to ensure that they're appearing on content that is very closely related to how they see themselves and how they want other people to see them. So this is a much more fertile environment for interaction with the brand. And I think that's really important because it's a big step forward. It also allows publishers to start to unblock a lot of their inventory because there's a lot less scope for false positives if you're expressing things what you want to be with rather than what you don't want to appear against.
So, as mentioned, and something I kind of touched on earlier, is that we are working with a number of other trade organizations on the topic of brand safety. And we actually started work on this last year. And the timing of which couldn't have actually been more serendipitous by the time the guidance actually came out, where we are starting to just kind of raise more awareness of how the context of a word matters in terms of how it's being used. So guidance that we released earlier this year, our content verification guidance, if anyone's looking for it, essentially looks to highlight this issue and kind of explain to advertisers the nuances that come with the English language, essentially, where the word shoot, for example, can be used in the context of death and injury, which is something that you may want to avoid, but actually is also very common in the words, fashion shoot or shoot for a goal, and understanding that, essentially just going back to the basics, that by looking at keywords alone without looking at the context that they are being used in is not an effective way to be managing your brand safety, and ultimately is having a negative impact on the sustainability of our industry. We then also, as Harvin mentioned, are starting to see more of understanding and awareness of sentiment of content. For example, where the word shoot in the context of shooting might be used in a positive way. So, for example, in the gaming environment, for example, the word shoot might be used in the context of shooting, but actually in a positive way. It's probably not the best example to have given, but you know what I mean, in terms of needing to understand the sentiment of content that your brand is appearing against. And more technology is evolving to understand that and differentiate those differences too.